Today's daf is daf nun dalid, and we got up to daf nun gimel amid beis. Boy Rav Ami. So if you're counting up approximately 15 lines up from the bottom, or 10 lines up from the bottom. Amasmasa mahu. So now we're talking about a disease that affected the animal's flesh. And in this case, there's some sort of decay. And the question is whether the animal's a treifa. Amar Rabbi Zera, Ha de boy Rabbi Ami, Kfar Persha Rav Yehuda. This question that's raised by Rav Ami was already addressed by Rav Yehuda. Tiamar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Bidrusa, when you're talking about an animal that was attacked by a dores, meaning an animal that has this venom in it that we discussed yesterday, Yadim basar keneged me'ayim. When the area around the bnei me'ayim, the stomach, is red, and the flesh has now changed its color, then it's called a drusa, and it's a treifa. But nismasem habasa romos kilu eno. Now, what does this mean? We're talking about the decay of the flesh, and we're comparing it to a notul, which means to an animal that's missing part of its body. And in the Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechta, at the beginning of the Perek, we had various categories of parts or organs of the body that were missing, and whether or not the animal became a treifa. For example, we had something called somes hagidin, which is a junction of the tendons, and if you remove that, the animal's a treifa. So hechi domi nismasmes, what is a measuring way that you could measure that the flesh of the animal is decayed? Omer Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yeshua Kol Shar Rofe, in any event that you take the animal to a veterinarian, and what will the doctor do? Gordo, he scrapes away that decayed flesh in order to expose the healthy flesh. Umamido al basar chai. So therefore, any time that the doctor will make a decision that we have to scrape off this flesh, it means that the flesh is decayed to the point that it's command lesedom. It's got to be removed. It's completely gone. And that's the only cure for such a condition, to scrape away the decayed flesh. So in effect, the Gemara is not giving us any sort of absolute standard and definition of decayed flesh. I guess in every case, you'd have to ask an expert, a doctor. Omer of Ashi, Ki Avinan Bei Rav Kahana Aisu Kamona Hire, they brought into the academy of Rav Kahana a lung of an animal to see whether or not it was a treifa. And if they would lay it down, it remains intact. But if they would lift it up vertically, havi talcha v'nafla tilchi, it would fall apart. And therefore, the Tarifna law, Rav Ashi notifies us that he would declare it treifa, mit Rabbi Yehuda, based on the fact that Rav Huna had already told us that if the flesh is decayed, then it's non-existent. And obviously, if a lung is non-existent, then the animal can't live. That's fatal, and therefore it's a treifa. Rav Nachman Omer, bekotes, in a case of an animal that was pierced by a coat, a thorn, ad shetinokev lecholol. The animal's only treifa if it was pierced all the way to the body cavity. Cholol means the cavity, the empty part of the body, which means the chest or the abdominal cavities. However, if the thorn did not penetrate the cavity, then we consider that it could get back into health, and then it's not automatically a treifa, but rather we have to give an examination. Now, if we have an internal examination, then normally what we'll find is that there's no puncture to any of the vital organs. And again, it's only be a treifa if it was pierced all the way down to the body cavity. However, in the case of a drusa, an animal that was attacked by a dores, like a wolf or a lion, mishiyadim basa keneged, if the flesh surrounds the stomach area and it's red, then we consider it already a treifa. Rav Zvid masni hachi. Rav Zvid has a slightly different presentation and tradition. Bidrusa mishiyadim basar keneged me'ayim. What would it be a case, as we said before, that the animal was attacked by a wolf, a wolf that attacked it? Then, if the flesh around the stomach area, he calls it the viscera, is reddened, then it's a treifa. So far, we have no new insights. But here, in the next part, Rav Zvid adds the following: B'simonim, if the animal is clawed in the neck, which is opposite the kana and veshet, ad she'adimu simonim. If the simonim turned red, which means the change of color is indicative that the clawing and the venom that was penetrated into the animal may have hit the simonim, then it becomes a treifa. So this has to do with the Gemara that we learned yesterday, that the two simonim are very tough and resistant to the effects of poison. So that even if the flesh opposite these two pipes, meaning the kon and the veshet, are reddened, it's not a treifa. Only if the pipes themselves have reddened as a result of the clawing of the animal is it a treifa. Omer of Papi, boy Rav Bibi Bar Abaye. We have now a situation in which Rav Bibi Bar Abaye vacillates. Veshet nekuva so b'mashu drusaso b'mashu. When we said that if the veshet has a puncture that's any small size, then it's a treifa. And a drusa, which was the victim of a clawing, likewise, if there's a red spot of any size, it's a treifa. Kana. But what about the case of a kana? The kana, which is the windpipe, we said is not like the esophagus, but rather it needs a much more profound puncturing in order to render the animal a treifa. What is the size of that puncture? It's ki'isar. Now, we'll soon see that isar is a coin that dates back to earlier times, and the Gemara is going to try later on to figure out in our coins, meaning coins at the time of the Talmud, what would be the same size of an isur. And now drusaso bekama. What happens, again, if the animal was clawed through the neck and it affects the simonim? What is the shear of the red spot that we said would indicate that the animal was a drusa, and even the tough simonim somehow succumbed to the venom that was penetrated by this clawing animal. Is it the same as the size of the of the um, of the puncture of the kana, which means it's a an isar, or is there a different shear? Then finally he came to a conclusion. Now, what's going on here is that until now, we always pointed out that the esophagus, the veshet, is much more sensitive and it becomes a treifa even b'mashu. Whereas with regard to the windpipe, the trachea, we said that it's got to be a much more profound puncture. But in the case of a drusa, what we're saying is that we're not going to differentiate between the esophagus and the windpipe, and any size will make the animal into a treifa, even if we're talking about the windpipe, my timer. Why is it that if you find this red spot and it's very small, it never, and you find it in the windpipe, nevertheless you render the animal a treifa, whereas in the case of a puncture, we said it's got to be the size of an isar when you're dealing with the windpipe. And the Gemara answers that ziare mikla koli v'ozil, the poison, the venom that shoots off from the claws of the predator and causes a red spot on the body of the victim, it's going to spread, and somehow mikla koli means it like burns up the whole area around that red spot in the trachea, so that we don't even need to actually find an isar's worth of red spot, but the smallest red spot is already considered as if the entire isar area of the windpipe was affected by the venom of the predator. Yosef Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Mat B'Kmei de Rav Nachman, v'Yosef ka'amar, drusa sha'amru tzricha b'dika keneged b'nei amei ayin. According to this tradition of Rav Yitzchak, there's a very limited area of the body that needs examination when we have a suspicion of a drusa, of being clawed. And that limited part of the body is the Bnei Me'ayin. We only have to look and check the Bnei Me'ayin. And then Rav Nachman says, Elokim b'loshen shvua, Mori bar Rav, Rav already taught us that the examination is a greater examination. It's not sufficient to check out the Bnei Me'ayin, but rather mikapa v'ad atma. What does that mean, mikapa v'ad atma? So we don't know what mikapa means, but we know what atma means. Atma is the thigh. And what is my kappa? So the Gemara goes through two possibilities. One possibility the Gemara is going to reject, because then Rav Nachman is saying the identical thing that we heard from Rabbi Yitzchak, namely kappa dida. Dida means the foreleg, which is otherwise called the shoulder blade. And again, we're going from the shoulder blade down to the thigh. That's exactly keneged b'nei me'ayim. So what did Rav Nachman, claim? Oh, Rav had a different, more profound kind of examination. Ella, but rather the word mikapa means kappa de mocha. We go back to the brain itself, the skull itself, and we're going to need an examination from the brain all the way down to the thigh, which is a much greater area than the b'nei me'ayim. And not only that, it includes even the simanim. Ki solik Rav Chia bar Yosef, Rav Chia went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Solik means he went up. And whenever you're talking about going to Eretz Yisrael, we talk about up. right? Because Eretz Yisrael Gvoa Mikol Arotzos. Ashkechinu Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish the Yasvi v'Kalmai. Jerusa Sha'omru Tzricha Bedika Keneged Bnei Me'ayim. So now Reb Chia is faced with the following situation. He came to Eretz Yisrael. He knew that Rav had this more extensive, a requirement of a more extensive examination in the case of a drusa, and now he finds that Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are both saying that all you need is a bedika keneged bnei me'ayim. Amalahus Reb Chia says to Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, "Hello, Kim, as we saw before, Modu Bey Rav Mikapa Mori Bey. I'm sorry, Rav Mikapa V'Yaratma," and that's a much greater circumference of an examination. Amar le Reish Lakish Manu Rav Umanu Rav Lo Yadani le. You're quoting Rav. I never heard of Rav. Who is he? You're making it to be, oh, we have to change our psak because of something that was ruled by Rav. Who is this guy, Rav? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Reish Lakish, you know who Rav is. Lo nehiro leili oso talmud sheshimish is Rabbi Rabba. Rabbi Rabba is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? That you must remember the disciple who studied with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and with Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia was Rav's uncle. Velokim, and I could swear that kol osan shonim sheshimesh oso talmud v'yeshiva, when during many years Rav was in the yeshiva of Rebbe HaKadosh and of Rabbi Chia, shimashti, right, b'yeshiva, and Rav would sit, va'ani shimashti b'amida, I stood, because if a Talmud is greater, then he could sit, but a Talmud who's not on that level has to stand. And this is based on a Gemara, which comes up later on in the Masechta, but it's also elsewhere. In any event, man gavar hu de gavar bekula. And you should know about Rav that his greatness extends beyond just Torah learning. It has to do with his Yiras Shamayim, his midos, his piety. And now apparently Reish Lakish is remembering, as Rabbi Yochanan jolted his memory, and Reish Lakish all of a sudden wakes up out of his dream, and he said, Mi'ad pasuk Reish Lakish v'yomar, Baram Zochor Oso Aish L'Tov. I remember this person favorably. Sha'omar Shmua Mipiv, because I was very excited about a particular ruling that they quote that was attributed to Rav, and I embraced it. That Shmuta Shchuta Kshera, She Efsha Lishmuta Shetiyase Shchuta. What happens if you find after the shechita that the windpipe is dislodged, meaning it's not connected to the jaw, which would make it into a treifa, but we don't know exactly whether it was dislodged at the time of the shechita or subsequently. So now Rav gives us the following rule of thumb, that it's impossible to shecht an animal and sever its windpipe without it being lodged and connected to the jaw. So the fact that we find that it's dislodged must be that it was dislodged after the shechita. And it's impossible to have been dislodged before the shechita and then be severed by the shechita. In other words, I guess the trachea, the windpipe, is moving around and you can't shecht it properly. For Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Yavi v'Yakiv. Rabbi Yochanan actually disagrees with Rav, and apparently Reish Lakish accepted Rav. And according to Reish Lakish, we're going to have to do an entire complex test in order to figure out whether or not the trachea was dislodged at the time of the shechita, and therefore the animal was a treifa. What do? Yavi It doesn't say what he brings, but Yavi means we bring a knife, and therefore we're going to sever the trachea after the shechita. The yakif. Yakif means when you take two things and you put them near each other in order to compare them. That's called yakif. And now what's going to happen? You made a second cup. If the two cups are not similar to each other, then we're going to say that the animal is kshera. But if the two cuts are similar in appearance, the animal is a treifa. And Rashi explains the following, that if the two cuts appear similar, then it's possible that the first cut was made to an animal who had a dislodged trachea, whose trachea was not attached to the jaw. The difference in appearance, in the case where they're different from another, these two cuts, must be attributed to the fact that the first one, which was made during the shechita, was made to an attached trachea, whereas the second one was made to a detached trachea. So let's just review what Rabbi Yochanan is arguing here through his examination by making a second sever, is that if they're two different appearances, these cuts, it means that there's a fundamental difference between the first and the second cut. The cut was made when the trachea was lodged in the jaw, and the second one was a cut that was made after the after the trachea was already dislodged, disconnected from the jaw. That's why they look different. And it means that the original shechita was done at a time when the trachea was attached in its normal, healthy way to the jaw. And therefore the animal is kosher. Rav Nachman, lo shanu, don't think that Rav Yochanan, with his test of Yavi v'Yakiv, will always absolutely be machshir the animal when the two cuts are dissimilar. Lo shanu ela shelo tofas b'simonim. Aval tofas b'simonim v'shachat efshel shmuta shetas shchuta. Meaning, even this principle that we think that the shechita must have happened because it was successful to cut the simona because they were attached to the jaw, that's not always true. We can't always rely on that fact. If the shochet grabbed on to the two simonim, then it's very possible that even though the simonim are not connected to the jawbone, nevertheless, he was able successfully to do the shechita, but the animal was a treifel. Now we go back to the Mishnah, and the Mishnah says, Zeh HaKlal. Now, this Mishnah of Zeh HaKlal is the first Mishnah in the Perek, and we're going to learn later on, and very shortly, on this Amud, a second Mishnah in the Perek, which also concludes with Zeh HaKlal. So now we have a rule in Mishnaic literature that whenever the Mishnah has Zeh HaKlal, it's coming as a ribui, which means that the Mishnah is implying that besides the treifos that were enumerated in our Mishnah, there are other additional treifos. Lasuye mai, what are these additional treifos? Lasuye shev shmaitita. So we may recall at the beginning of this perek that there are 7 categories which the Amoraim listed of treifos. They aren't mentioned in the Mishnah; they were added by the Amoraim, and they're hinted at in the words Zeh HaKlal. And again, if we go back to the beginning of the perek, like 10 blot ago, more than that, we'll find the list of those 7 categories of treifa that were added by the Amoraim to our Mishnah. Okay. Now we're going to have a statement from Rabbi Yosef, who's going to add another category of treifa. Debei Yosef, Okay, now I'm a little bit confused about one thing in this sugya, and that is that the Gemara is going to talk now about hunters, animal hunters, and what they did to their uh, hunt captured animals. And I'm trying to figure out why they would do such a thing. So I have a feeling, again, I could be very wrong about this, that the hunters had to do something to kill the animal, even though it might not. Anyway, let's just learn the Gemara and you'll see what I mean. So Rishpa means he was a hunter. His name was Yosef. And what he used to do was machu, which means to hit, begida, nashia. What's gida nashia? I think we had this in the past. That's the sciatic nerve. The katle, and that's how he killed his whatchamacallit, his prey. He wasn't apparently interested in shechting the animal and eating its meat or selling its meat to a Jewish market. Maybe he would, he would skin the animal and, put it up on his wall. Maybe he would sell it to a guy. Maybe it was just the fun of hunting the animal, the challenge, and he would hit it in the sciatic nerve. Now, I'm not sure exactly how he hit it. It would seem that he hit it with a stick, but Rashi says that not necessarily so. He may have shot an arrow into the sciatic nerve, and that would automatically kill the animal. Or maybe not. Also, Likami de Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So again, I don't know exactly who came to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira as one of the great Tanoim of his time to ask the question as to whether or not such an animal could sustain the loss, and therefore he's not a treifa. Even though, again, the hunter was trying to kill the animal. Amalahu, Bechila Hosef ala Trefos Yesh, Ein Lecha Ela Mashamanu Chachamim. We don't add categories of treifa. If this puncture or hit to the sciatic nerve would be another case of a treifa, then it would have been listed somewhere in the Mishnah or by the Amoraim. We don't have it. And therefore, we have to assume it's not a treifa, which I find very strange because it seems that the hunter wanted to kill the animal. An injured sciatic nerve is not truly fatal. So again, we're going to have to explain why Yosef the hunter would shoot into the sciatic nerve if if it was not a fatal injury. So that's what the Gemara is going to say now. Tbeira Papa Bar Abba Rishpa, again another hunter. I don't know exactly. I think what's going on here is that Rav Papa had within his household some hunters. It's hard for me to believe that Rav Papa himself was a hunter. Well, I don't know. It says Rishpa. Rishpa's a hunter. Anyway, so what did they do, these hunters? Machu, again, machu means they would strike. Bikulia, in the kidney. Vikatli, and that's how they killed their prey. But Rashi says the arrow would strike the top of the kidney. and it did not penetrate the body cavity and render the animal treifa. Also, l'kami de Rabbi Abba, omalahu v'chilos al treifos yesh ein l'cha ela mashamanu chachamim. So apparently, this arrow that strikes the top of the kidney never penetrated the body cavity. And again, I would assume that the animal had a kidney now that was not functional, but nevertheless could still survive, maybe because it has another kidney. But wait a minute, all these hunters would kill by serving a blow to the sciatic nerve or by puncturing the kidney with an arrow. So why are you telling me it's not a treifa? Gemiri de badre la samachaya. Oh, yes, you're right. Certainly the animal is going to die. But since the animal could be saved through medicinal administration, and I don't know exactly what the veterinarians would do, but spread out some sort of medicines on the sciatic nerve or on the kidney in such a way that they would bring the animal back to health. Therefore, that injury is not deemed a fatal injury, and therefore the animal is not called a treif. So we have here at the end of our Mishnah, which we've been studying for already about 2 weeks or more, a new principle here that even if the animal is eventually going to die as a result of an injury, like in the case of these hunters, nevertheless, if you can bring this animal back to health through some medicinal process, through some medicinal remedy, then the animal's not a treif. Now we get to the next Mishnah. V'elu ksheros v'behema, and then we'll have a Mishnah about elu ksheros ba'of, meaning now the Mishnah is going to give us a list of injuries where the animal is still kosher. Number 1, nikva gargeres. As you know, the gargeres is the windpipe, and a nekev, although in the veshet would make the animal treifa, if it's in the windpipe, it's still kosher. O nistika, or let's say there was a split, like vertically, in the length of the trachea of the windpipe, it's still kosher, and it's not a treif. We have to add, as Rashi points out over here, a Gemara that we had about 10 blot ago, that there's one condition: the very top and the bottom of the trachea remain intact. Next, ad kamati chaser. At what point, and this we had already, would a piece that's missing from the trachea make the animal into a treifa? Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer ad, as long as the missing part of the trachea is less than Isar Italki, the Italian Isar, which we don't know what it is, but the Gemara is going to talk about that, then it still remains kosher. What happens if exactly the size of an Isar? That's going to be a machlokus in the Gemara. Nifchasa gulgoles. Now we're talking about an injury to the skull, and the skull was diminished, but velo nikev krum shel moach, the membrane that surrounds the brain was not punctured. Apparently, if the membrane of the brain is not perforated, then we assume that the skull was not cracked all the way through. Nikav halev, if the heart was punctured, but velo lebeis chalolo, but not into its cavity, The animal's heart was pierced, but the hole does not penetrate to the cavity of the heart. The animal is kosher. Nishbra shidra. So again, there's two parts to the spinal column. There's the spinal column itself, and then there's the cord, the spinal cord. So in this case, although the spinal column was broken, the cord was not severed. Lo nifsach hachut shala. That's called a chut. Chut means the spinal cord. It's still a kosher animal. Nitla kaved. If there was something left after the liver was removed, how much was left of the liver, nishtayr menu kizayis, then the animal is kosher. According to another opinion we had, even a mashu of the liver that was left unremoved, it's kosher. Now we have different parts of the digestive system, hemses ubeis hakosos, which again we had, if you remember, the Latin words are omasum and reticulum were punctured. But ze betoch ze, one into the other. So this has to do with that idea that we discussed at great length about plugging it up. So we're not talking about two distinct punctures, but rather these two parts of the digestive system were joined. The hole is between them, and food could pass from one to the other. Nitalat chol, the spleen was removed. Nitla kloyos, the kidneys were removed. Nitla lechi tachton, the lower jaw was removed. But the trachea and the esophagus are still connected to the flesh. And in all these cases, it's kosher. V'charusa. Now we have a shriveled lung, but it was bidei shamayim. It wasn't an impact of some sort of injury. The lung shriveled as a result of the animal being frightened. That's called bidei shamayim. And the lung now becomes like hard. The fright was not caused by any sort of human agency, but rather by thunder or lightning. And we're going to have to examine the shriveled lung to determine what was the cause. Was it human or heavenly? Hagluda. Now we have machlokas Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about a flayed animal, which means that the animal's skin came off as a result of boils. Rabbi Meir machshir v'Chachamim hoslim. Chachamim say that if there's not too much skin left on the animal, then it's a treifa animal. Okay, now we get to the Gemara. Itmar. Here we have a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about how to learn the two Mishnayos, the first Mishnah and the second Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Elu Trefos, when the opening Mishnah in this parak says Elu Trefos, then we take that literally. These are the Trefos, but not others. Rav Shimon Lakish Omar, Elu Ksheros Dafka, the one that we should take as strict is this Mishnah of Elu Ksheros. And any others are what do you call it? Are trefos. What's this all about? The nafkamina is going to be Rav Masna, and the pella here in this sugya is that I think, check me out if I'm right about this, Reish Lakish is going to be the machmir. So far, it seems that Reish Lakish was the mekil because he's putting the emphasis on our Mishnah. What does Rav Masna have in mind? Omer Rav Masna. Now we're talking about the ball of the joint of the leg. Hai budka di atma. So I think in the past we may have had the word atma, and we said it's a thigh bone, and the thigh bone is connected to another bone with a socket, a ball. That ball is called a buka. So the ball of the thigh bone popped out of its place. And Rav Masna claims that such an animal is treif. And now we're going to say that this ruling of Rav Masna is the subject of a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. How so? Rabbi Yochanan Amar Elu treifos dafka, and therefore he's going to be makil, and he's going to reject Rav Masna. Tana treifos v'tana zaklal. Okay, now we're going to go through the logical analysis of Rabbi Yochanan of the first Mishnah in the Perek.